Game over, man. Game over. Johnny. You're gonna need a bigger potion. So serious.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for December 28th, 2025, and I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brennan Cassidy.
Hey, thanks for joining us, everybody, as we have a discussion that will be mostly done through primal screaming and singing
and dance.
Yes.
What are those dance moves called in this movie? Those thrusts that they do?
There's a lot of thrusting, a lot of moaning, a lot of screaming. Yeah. A lot of that going on.
Yeah, for those listening, you should definitely watch this episode on YouTube for some real thrust action, I must say.
Exactly. Who knows? Maybe we'll bust into some speaking of the tongues. You know, we'll do all of it.
We're gonna shake things up, pun intended.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a really good way to phrase it. Yeah, we are here to talk about The Testament of Anne Lee, which comes out this weekend as we are recording this. And I am excited to talk about this one. It is from director Mona Fastvold, who co-wrote this with one Brady Corbet, who released The Brutalist last year, the both of them. Now, obviously, The Brutalist was directed by Corbet, but was co-written by the both of them. That film was. So they are back as a team. They are back together once again. The Testament of Anne Lee. What do you think about them as a directing writer partnership now that we've had a few of these under their belt?
Yeah.
Going back to Vox Lux, The Brutalist, The Testament of Anne Lee. What do you think?
Is this a new trend where we're seeing filmmaking partnerships that aren't related in a way, like by blood? You know, we talked about this with Train Dreams earlier this year between Clint Bentley and Greg Cuidar. They work as a partnership, but they also take turns directing each respective movie, even if they're both producers and writers on each and every film that they make together. This is kind of an interesting trend that we're seeing as far as these types of partnerships between filmmakers. And I think it makes a lot of sense when you think about something like The Brutalist and you compare it to something like The Testament of Anne Lee, which are very different movies thematically, as we'll talk about, but aesthetically, they are kind of similar. They have very similar vibes. A lot of that, of course, has to do with the music by Daniel Blumberg, which I'm sure we'll talk about here in spades when it comes to The Testament of Anne Lee. But they have very similar visceral kind of vibes, almost brutal to experience, pun intended. And I will say this, regardless of how I feel about the movie we're about to get into, I do like their visual language. I do like what they're doing with their respective films visually, because there's something so big yet small about them simultaneously. And I kind of like that weird middle ground that they find in all their movies. And this one certainly has that as well.
Yeah, it very much does. And to speak to what you're saying as far as the partnership here, it's interesting because it's clearly a trend that we've seen recently. Mm-hmm. Bentley and Cuidar, as you talked about with Train Dreams and Sing Sing, deeply love them as a duo. What's interesting here, however, is that Fastvold and Corbet, they're partners creatively, but it's separate from something like the Coen brothers, for example, or the Safdies, who have worked together as these sibling partnerships go. They are, I don't think they're technically married, but they are together. And they do have a child together, I believe, as well. Okay. So they live together. They have a romantic relationship. It's somewhat akin to Ethan Coen and Trisha Cook and that relationship. It's a little bit more like that dynamic.
They're literal partners in more ways than one.
Absolutely. But aside from their romantic relationship, obviously they're creative partners as well.
Absolutely.
Very different than Coen and Cook and what they tend to cook up, all pun intended, I guess.
This episode has had more puns thus far than I actually expected.
And it might not stop. I imagine it won't stop. But for all the reasons you just laid out there, their approach to filmmaking so very different. But I do love how they're able to bring this sense of scale to their movies, even if narratively they're grounded and not. There isn't a huge spectacle in terms of the narratives of their films, but it feels big. It feels like we're watching something grand, something that you'd watch out of a huge blockbuster James Cameron like spectacle. Like their films just have this bigness, even though they're actually quite contained in a lot of ways. And then you couple that with the filmmaking and craft, and they're a duo I'm quickly becoming fond of, for sure.
I think you used a word there just a moment ago by calling their films kind of untamed. Is that correct? Because I do agree with that. There's actually a review for The Testament of Anne Lee, I think it was from The Telegraph, that called the movie, quote, fearlessly feral. And I feel like that's a really great way to describe both this movie and The Brutalist in a way. There's something kind of wild and off about these movies, almost animalistic about them. I feel like that's more so a descriptor for something like The Testament of Anne Lee. This is a very animalistic movie in many ways. It's in some ways, it's a very horny movie, as we'll also talk about, in a very ironic way. But I feel like this is definitely something you kind of sense in both of these movies that each of them has directed in the past few years. And I think it makes their movies so unique, which is something I like to see when filmmakers are trying new things now.
For sure. Did you see Mona Fastvold's 2020 film, The World to Come?
I did not. That was with Vanessa Kirby and Catherine Waterston? Yeah, I heard good things, but I didn't see that one, unfortunately.
Yeah, I don't think I got a chance to see that one either, although it probably came out, or at least for me, came to my attention near the end of the film. Or near the end of that year, excuse me. So I don't think that I got a chance to really see that one. Fairly certain that one is on my to-see list, but I have heard decent things about it. I don't know if it was hailed as one of the best films of that year, and perhaps that's why it fell under my radar a little bit.
Do you you obviously remember the movie The Mustang, right?
Yes.
With Matthias Schoenaerts, directed by Laura de Clermont-Trinare. Mona Fastvold was also a writer on that film.
Yeah, she did write that. Yeah. Yeah, and I did like The Mustang.
I thought that was pretty good. Great lead performance in that one.
Absolutely. I have not seen The Sleepwalker either. That was her debut film that came out in 2014 with Christopher Abbott, Brady Corbet, of course, in that film as well. I believe that's where they met, was on that film. So,
he was a co-writer on that one too, and is also in that movie.
And is in that film, yes.
The first thing I ever saw Brady Corbet in was Michael Haneke's English language remake of Funny Games. I think that was the first thing I ever saw him in, and he stood out. He was creepy in that movie.
Yeah, he was. I believe we talked about this last year when The Brutalist came out, but his career is so fascinating.
I agree. I have a lot of respect for him.
Yeah, especially as an American filmmaker and actor. You almost wouldn't think that.
He seems so European or something.
Yeah, and I don't know much about his upbringing. Maybe he did grow up in Europe. I don't know, but
maybe. I mean, maybe he gets a lot of it from Fastvold. She's Norwegian, so maybe there's a lot of cultural listening happening between the two of them.
I do see here that he was born in Scottsdale, Arizona.
That's like as American as you get.
Exactly. Yeah. No, he is fully American in a lot of ways, but I don't know. I'd have to go and do that research. I don't know how he ended up being so European in a lot of ways, but his career is certainly fascinating. He was also in Mysterious Skin, which I really love.
He's great in that movie too.
Yeah. Yeah, fascinating little career. Anyway, We're not here to talk about Brady Corbet. Maybe
let's talk about Mona.
Do that next year or the next couple of years, whatever. I don't know if they're just going to keep flipping back and forth from year to year. But yeah, we are here to talk about Mona Fastvold, though. And similarly, while I haven't seen her other films, I have seen her writing work, so a bunch of her writing work to this point, and now her directorial effort here with The Testament of Anne Lee. So yes, someone I will certainly be much more on my radar moving forward. That's for sure. Any other table setting before we get to the film?
I think that mostly covers it. We'll obviously talk a lot about the film's musicality, Daniel Blumberg. We'll talk a lot about this film's cast because Amanda Seyfried is getting a lot of acclaim for this movie. We'll have a lot to say about her. She has been yet another one of those on-screen presences that has a very varied and kind of strange career as well. This is certainly far removed from her comedic turn in something like Mean Girls over 20 years ago, right?
Yeah. And that was one of her first films, if I'm not mistaken.
She was kind of the standout in that one in a weird way.
Yeah. She really is, especially now. It feels like even more so, but
I'm pretty sure she's from near my hometown where I grew up.
Is she?
I think so. I'm going to double check that. I think she's from near the Allentown area.
Yeah. But yeah, you are right. She has a fascinating little career as well. And,
Born in Allentown, PA. Yep, I was right.
There you go. A lot of really a lot of fascinating movies on her filmography for sure.
Say what you will about Mamma Mia. I'm not a big fan of those movies, but she's pretty good in them.
Oh yeah. I mean, she's great in everything. Like I loved her in Les Mis. Say what you will about that film, but really liked her there. What's another? First Reformed. Her little role in that film, very good.
Jennifer's Body, cult classic nowadays.
Yes. Exactly. So yeah, I mean, she's always a fascinating little filmmaker.
Mank
or actress. Mank. Yeah. Okay. With that laid out, let's go ahead and jump into this. The Testament of Anne Lee is written and directed by Mona Fastvold. It stars the aforementioned Amanda Seyfried, as well as Lewis Pullman, Thomasin McKenzie, Stacey Martin, Christopher Abbott, Tim Blake Nelson in a small little appearance here, Jamie Baggio, David Kale, and a bunch of others that come and go throughout the film. If you're not familiar with The Testament of Anne Lee, and depending on when you listen to this, some of you may not have seen the film quite yet, although I imagine if you are listening to this, you have seen it. Just in case, though, it is about Anne Lee. Shocker. It's about The Testament of Anne Lee. Who saw that coming?
Oh, titular character, so underrated.
Is the founding leader of the Shaker movement, proclaimed as the female Christ by her followers. It depicts her establishment of a utopian society and the Shakers' worship through song and dance based on real events, it says here. Yeah, and I can confirm, I looked it up. It is indeed based on real events.
Yep. The Shakers are a real thing. Practicing celibacy, communal utopian lifestyle, as you said, pacifism, I think, are also some of their primary forms of teaching, if you will. I'm looking this up as we talk. Apparently, there are only, I guess, 3 members of the Shaker community left in America at this point. By 1920, I think only 12 communities were remaining. So this makes for a very fascinating story, and for reasons we'll talk about, I think there are a lot of parallels you can draw between this movie and other recent films depicting some form of religious fanaticism.
So that to me is really fascinating, what you're saying there as far as the dissipation, one could say, of the Shaker movement, because that actually plays very well into my thoughts on this film, thematically speaking.
Interesting. Okay.
Yes.
I'm curious as to what that is. Yeah, because I think there's a lot about that I certainly understand, just given what this film depicts as part of the Shaker community's teachings. But I also think there are weirdly a lot of things you can relate it to as far as like modern day evangelical teachings, just in general. I think it kind of fits in this middle ground of sorts.
Yeah. We'll talk about it. Let's talk about it. All right. Brendan, what did you think about The Testament of Anne Lee?
I think what we were just talking about there makes this movie a fascinating one regardless. And I do like the movie because of that. That was sort of a great way to slowly ease us into how we feel about the movie and why we do find it to be such a fascinating one, because I do think this is a story worth telling. I think there are a lot of interesting parallels you can make between the Shaker community and how it both aligns and completely distances itself from modern day religious fanaticism, but in a way you can kind of sense maybe the Shaker community being almost the birthplace of some of that fanaticism, which I think is really intriguing. And I love the way that this movie portrays it as a musical, because for the most part, while this is a musical, it's also not really a musical at all. If anything, the majority of the musical numbers here feel like they are some sort of musical prayer, as if this is how these individuals actually practice their religious teachings. And the majority of any religion, especially in Christianity, usually involves some form of song and prayer. And the most how it's depicted here actually feels rather in line with that, which is why I think the way it acts as a musical is kind of interesting. It almost feels like a form of worship, more so than a traditional musical in a way. And I found that approach really intriguing. And I think it's also very provocative to see some of these explorations done in a very specific way, which I'll talk about later. I think just given the fact that this is about Ann Lee specifically adds a very interesting, provocative angle that we haven't really seen before when it comes to movies about religious fanaticism. The movie does have a lot going for it that's really unconventional. I guess my biggest issue with the movie, and why I don't know if I'm in love with it as many others seem to be, for how unconventional the movie seems to be, or at least what it's striving for, I do think there is a conventionality to how it's told. And I don't know if there's maybe just a redundancy to some of these sequences and how they feel kind of similar as far as how it flows from scene to scene. Maybe a lot of that also has to do with the voiceover narration, which, you know me, JD, I'm very hit or miss when it comes to voiceover narration in movies. If it works, it can be one of the best things you can offer in a movie, but it's sometimes very difficult to make voiceover work and make it feel like it's so necessary. I don't think it's necessary here. And I think it kind of adds a normality to a movie that's going for something that feels a little bit more abnormal, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think that's maybe my biggest issue with it, because there's something so unique about the presentation and the visual language and the musical language of this movie. I do wish it was communicated in a more abstract way to match that. And there are things about it that add a conventionality to it that I didn't always love. But when it's functioning outside those realms of conventionality to deliver something that feels very unique and singular, there are some very haunting and hypnotic sequences here that really did arrest me.
Yeah, let me start off my opening thoughts by saying that I do really like this film a lot. I do really like, and we're going to talk about this a lot at the In Session Film Awards that are coming up here in a few weeks' time. But 2025 has been riddled with movies about grief and motherhood. When you look at Hamnet, Die My Love, The Chronology of Water, which we haven't talked about here yet, but that one is another one to add to the canon. If I Had Legs, I'd Kick You. Less about grief, but certainly the traumas of motherhood. 28 years later, in a way, different than the other films I just mentioned, but that certainly
it pivots into that surprisingly.
Yeah, and even Train Dreams, which circles more around fatherhood, but similarly grief and parenthood. All of those films, and I'm sure there are others that I'm missing, tie into that overarching idea. And The Testament of Ann Lee is another incredible film to add to that crop. Everything we see from Ann here is driven by the trauma of losing not one, not two, not three, but 4 babies back to back to back to back.
You certainly get an understanding as to why this group wants to practice celibacy after an experience.
Well, and I'm going to get to that. I don't want to get ahead of ourselves yet, but I do want to get to that.
Sure.
Those scenes, and to give Fastvold a lot of credit here, she does not shy away from them, depicting that trauma. And those scenes are obviously quite devastating, which leads
They're
to
graphic. Yeah.
her spiritual catharsis. And again, I do want to talk about that as this conversation goes. And while there is much to parse in terms of that transition for Anne, for me, it's how Fastvold conveys her transformation from a cinematic perspective. As a musical, I do think this film is remarkably hypnotic and visually evocative. Daniel Blumberg's work here is riveting and a key component as to why the film is as captivating as it is. The marriage between music and choreography is almost like a religious experience on its own.
Sure.
I say that somewhat jokingly, but Blumberg did talk about how he drew inspiration from original Shaker hymns, and the choreography here is clearly invoking Christian revival energy. And as a result, the musical sequences are fervently rhythmic. There's a lot of movement and heavy breathing. The singing and dancing is controlled chaos. There are bodies moving in every which direction, but somehow there is an artful uniformity to it. And there's just a ton of energy. There's so much happening in the frame in terms of movement and music that it's almost overwhelming, but I say that complimentary. And it's ecstatic, it's almost primal and deeply communal. And I did find that breathtaking to watch.
Yeah, and I do want Oh, keep going. I want to jump in and say something, but I'll let you keep going for a second.
Yeah, and additionally to the music and choreography, the production design, the costume design here, I think is all really great. The cinematography on the whole is excellent. Amanda Seyfried is electric in a totally committed performance. She really is astounding. All of the awards buzz around her, I do think, is more than well earned. Lewis Pullman is also noteworthy. The rest of the cast is quite good as well. In terms of energy and craft and tone, I do think the film is undeniable and completely invigorating. That said, though, I do have some criticisms about the storytelling here, and it sounds like this is where you and I do tend to agree. And it is the one thing that keeps me from fully loving this as one of the best films of the year. At times, it is a little redundant once Anne makes her spiritual transition. There's a good chance that some of this could remedy itself on a rewatch, but at this point, I am a little mixed on some of the middle of this film and when it acts as a biopic. When it's a musical, I am in a trance. I'm fully with the film. I am the meme of the guy sitting forward in the chair wholeheartedly. But the biopic element of this feels a little flat to me. And there's more of that here than I somewhat anticipated.
Same.
I don't love the A to B to C storytelling, how we get from one moment to the next. But when we're in the moment, that's when this film thrives. And I think there's so much to love about this film in that regard. But the structure of the film from a script writing perspective, it's just the one thing that keeps me from really fully loving it like some critics have. I wish that I could go that far, but I don't know if I'll come around on the screenplay here.
Yeah, well, that's why I brought up the voiceover narration as maybe one of the big reasons as to why I share those criticisms with you, because without the voiceover, I do wonder if I would have been able to vibe with some of those sequences a bit more, rather than listen to what historical angles were being told. Yet at the same time, I do appreciate that something like that is here to add kind of a mythological element to this movie as far as how it's treating history, and maybe some of this might actually be twisted over time, and I kind of like that idea. But I do think it does distract at least me, and it sounds like it does for you, when there are moments here that are just so hypnotic from a musical standpoint. I just wanted to, I don't know if I want to say I wanted to live in those sequences, because there is a harrowing nature to what's being depicted here, but I wanted to experience them and feel suffocated by them, if that makes sense. What I was about to say in your during your opening thoughts, as I was about to rudely cut you off for a second, was there are many musicals out there where I feel like characters burst into song simply because the genre they're playing in forces them to, right?
Yeah.
But here, the majority of these musical numbers feel like they are organically interwoven within the world.
Yes. Yeah.
There's maybe one or two musical numbers that feel like more traditional musical numbers. I might get to those later as far as things maybe I didn't love quite as much as the others, but for the most part, these feel like organic forms of prayer. It actually feels like lived in musicality, which is really intriguing. For the most part, we get musicals that are either full-blown musicals or just music performance movies. But this weirdly kind of fits in the middle, which is, I guess, a delicate and yet tricky line to pull off. And it kind of does. I think that's why those musical sequences are so well directed and so provocative, because they find this new, almost reinvention of how you can do a movie musical. And I think those sequences are really unique because of that.
I agree. And as I noted in my opening thoughts, I think that's where this film thrives. And I do love the ambitious approach to the film in terms of its musicality. And I do love the organic quality to it, as you're talking about there, because it really doesn't feel like a traditional musical in any way. Most of what we see here is them performing a ritual. It's them in worship. And it speaks to the emotional underbelly that they're experiencing here. It speaks to the to a lot of the hardships that they have, you know, like when it comes to their faith and the persecution they're feeling. And they lean into that. They lean into their suffering to give worship. And that doesn't always have to take place inside a church or inside a home that they consider to be their place of worship. Sometimes it happens on a boat. It happens out in the world. But when they feel inspired, when they feel like they need to cathartically relish in worship because of that emotional turmoil that they may be experiencing, whatever that may be. I do love how that simply comes out organically. So it doesn't feel like you're watching Wicked, for example, where the song simply comes out of the fact that it is a musical. And characters are forced to, as you noted. This is simply born out of their humanity and that emotional underbelly, which I do love as well. And again, when you couple that with the filmmaking here, again, that haunting, that I think you used the word harrowing, that harrowing esque vibe of how those scenes are captured here. And it certainly makes for like this entrancing cinematic experience.
It has the aesthetic of a horror movie at times, and it's very primal in that regard.
Very primal,
too. And it's also very provocative too. And I alluded to this as well, as far as how it portrays religious fanaticism, because on one hand, it ties back to what you said in your opening thoughts and how we actually get, I don't want to call it a justification as to why Ann Lee decides to form this particular group, but you certainly have an understanding as to why something like celibacy is so heavily practiced in their group because of such a traumatic experience, which is why I do agree with you in making the comparison to the many movies we saw in 2025 about motherhood and tragedy / trauma specifically. It very much fits into that category. It's been a weird year as far as many movies delivering on that theme, and many of them do it very well. But this is yet another very well conveyed example of that trauma and that tragedy. And it does give you, as the viewer, an understanding as to why someone like an Ann Lee would formulate such a deep-rooted religious group with those types of practices. And I think that's a hard line to pull off by making you understand that, despite also feeling maybe a little bit turned off by some of the fanaticisms that we see at play, which is also what makes this movie very interesting, because we've seen many movies that portray religious fanaticism as a theme in some way, right? But I don't recall ever really seeing one, at least as of late, that depicts it where the practice itself is primarily being led by a woman. A lot of times it's mostly a man, maybe an abusive man of some sort, leading the charge in a way. So by having a woman like Ann Lee adds a very provocative nature to just this simple exploration on religious fanaticism, which kind of makes you think about it a little bit more. Like it kind of gives it this weird moral gray area in a way.
Yeah. I mean, how many women religious figures are there?
Very little.
Many. Yeah.
I mean, in a way, that's partially why Ann Lee considers herself as a Christ-like figure for this time, a female Christ-like figure. That's sort of how she's marketed as, in a way.
Yeah.
Right. She says that she has wed with Christ. That's sort of her introduction to this movement. Right.
Yeah. That whole prison sequence, that's essentially what's happening there, is her embracing that mantra. Yeah.
Yeah. So the film delivers a completely new angle at something like that, which regardless if the movie worked or not, just as a movie, I love that that's here, because just that simple idea and the fact that this is a movie that's portraying this particular side of history led by a particular figure that we normally don't associate with religious fanaticism, I found that really intriguing. And that alone, I think, is enough to get people talking.
Yeah, and I think that's a great transition to where I wanted to go next in this conversation. I very much do find a lot of what you're saying there quite fascinating. And there is a lot to be said with this film in terms of its themes on suffering and religious devotion. It's a meditation on faith and the collective experience and the human need for shared meaning. It's also about the idea of God testing people through tragedy and how faith is earned through suffering. All of that is interesting enough, but I think the most fascinating polarity here is between genuine spirituality and pragmatic avoidance of agony. One question, the question that comes to mind for me, and this isn't to downplay religion at all, but was Anne's spiritual transformation genuine? Was it from a place of understanding God in a deeper, more transcendent way? Or was it born out of, I don't want to experience tragic loss anymore, so I'm not going to live a normal life? I think there's an argument to be made that Anne's decision to become a spiritual leader founded in celibacy and exile is simply because she did not want to go through childbirth again and not pander to the norms of being a wife and mother. And again, I don't say that disparagingly. Given what Anne experiences here, no one would blame her for scheming her way out of having to go through any of that again. I think it's a visceral human response that any of us would have in her situation. And I just wonder if her transformation was more so a way of her pragmatically avoiding any more personal tragedy, because the way she treats her husband and the aftermath of it all is not biblical or from a conventional perspective of religion. And so she helps form a new religion, more or less, that's founded in celibacy and pacifism and this communal lifestyle, as we noted earlier. I think that's a fascinating duality to consider here. Maybe her faith and the extremity of it was something that was real to her. Maybe she did feel as if she was the female Christ. Or do you create a character so extreme, so brazen, that it allures people to you and it becomes an excuse to not have to indulge in the norms of the time and put yourself in a situation that is only going to create more tragedy for you? I think it's a fascinating duality to consider here. And I don't think the film is necessarily, it's certainly not giving you an answer to any of it, but I do think it does enough to warrant the question because of what we see at the beginning of the film and the prison sequence, as I noted earlier. There are a couple of great shots on Amanda Seyfried in that prison sequence as she is, she's clearly devoted to her faith, but it becomes something more when she's on the other side of, again, not one, not two, not three, but the fourth loss of a child. That's going to make anyone go crazy.
Yeah.
Certainly would make me go crazy as well. And I would do anything in my power to manifest never having to go through that again. And if that means that I become Jesus Christ 2.0, then I'm going to do that. I'm going to do that.
That's a hell of a way to market our podcast going forward. The only film podcast out there where one of the hosts is Jesus Christ 2.0.
Yeah. and to your point earlier, as we were at the beginning of this, the idea that there are very few Shakers left in the country might be indicative of its inauthenticity. And you couple that with, because so much of this is, I don't want to have sex. I want to be exiled. I don't want to live in a normal conventional world. Well, how sustainable is that? We are animals that need to breed. We have to engage
which is why I ironically called this movie kind of horny, right?
Yeah, and we do see that with some other characters, right? There's the Nancy and Richard characters who are younger, and the celibacy angle of it is too much. Maybe they believe in God, maybe they have a devotion to God, but the extremes are not something they are willing to participate in. So later on in the film, they leave. And they go get married. And again, it speaks to the pragmatic side of this. Practically speaking, you can't have a communal experience that is founded in celibacy. Like, how are you going to expand your cult if you can't breed? So it raises a lot of these interesting questions. And again, that's why for me, a lot of it comes back to, it's not really about faith. It's not really about any sort of devotion to God or biblical text. The fact that I'm going to create a religion that is based on celibacy and pacifism, and we're all going to be exiled, and our way to God is through suffering. Wink, wink. That's me. That like, I just need an excuse to not do that stuff. I just need an excuse to get away. And again, I'm not saying that at all to disparage her. I think the film does more than enough to show us, for us to emotionally resonate with that idea, to understand why she would go to those extremes, to create a character, to create a religion that for her personally gives her an out, gives her an excuse to not participate in any of that stuff again.
Well,
so that way she doesn't have to experience that tragedy again.
Well, and that's why I keep using the term, or at least a thematic idea, religious fanaticism. I don't necessarily disagree that the movie doesn't lean one way or another as far as the ambiguities as to whether Ann Lee fully buys into her religious creation, right? I think there's an argument to be made that at some point later on in her life, she probably eventually did buy into it. If it started out that way, that's maybe a very different conversation.
Yeah.
And I think that is open to audience interpretation. So when I say that the intent of the movie was clear to me as far as what it's doing, I don't know if that means it's very obviously clear to everybody. I don't think it's necessarily that easily one-sided, but I think it's very clear, at least to me in my reading of the movie, that this was not found. This religion was not found for genuine reasons. I don't think it was. And I think the reason why I don't think it was is because I think it adds to this overall larger point that I feel like the movie is trying to make, and how it depicts a very particular religious group, the Shakers specifically, who ironically don't really exist anymore. Yet you kind of see some of these evangelical-like practices in other religious groups nowadays, right? Like, in a way, the influence has kind of bled into other religious groups in some demographics, which kind of adds an irony to that, right? And I think you can argue that in some cases, not every case, because I think generally religion can be a helpful tool for a lot of people. It is for us. We've talked about that before. We've had very specific theological discussions on this podcast many times. But sometimes there are individuals that might use it as a distraction, right? To deal with the realities of the real world and what they're refusing to deal with. Right. Like they use it as a distracting coping mechanism as opposed to a genuine coping mechanism. And I think that might be in some ways one of the film's overarching points and how they're trying to use this shaker demographic as maybe a broad depiction of that idea, which is why it was very clear to me that this community was founded for, let's say, the wrong reasons and not based on genuine faith. Maybe Ann Lee at some point later in her life did fully buy into what she had created. That's still pretty ambiguous. I don't even know if I have an answer to that, but I don't know if it was genuine at the onset because but again, maybe someone might see this movie and think differently, but it's clear to me because I feel like that's the overarching point it's trying to make. I think it actually adds a timely nature to this overall film and to this overall idea and actually makes it feel even more contemporary than just being a straight up historical piece on a particular religious demographic. I think there's more to it than that.
I agree as well. And to your point about some of the extremities of the worship that we see here, the film doesn't necessarily invoke this. In fact, I think it's mostly clear that it doesn't. However, I think it's also worth pointing out that worship, sometimes extreme worship, existed long before the Quakers. And True. You see that in religious texts all the time. In fact, speaking in tongues goes back to not long after the death of Christ. So we have on record some versions of extreme worship for decades and decades, centuries before Ann Lee. Ann Lee just took that idea, added the shakiness part of it, if you will, and took it to a whole new level. So it's not as if she invented something that wasn't there before, which to me adds further credence to the idea that it's not necessarily something that she was fully enveloped in prior to the transformation.
If anything, maybe she helped spearhead the heightened nature of something that already existed, the overall idea that someone could manipulate it in a different way, which we see a lot of these days. I'm not saying that she was the first to ever do that, but maybe she was one of the first to do something like that in a very fantastical way.
Because we do see early on, she was a part of this religious group before her transformation there in the prison. It wasn't until she experienced the loss of 4 little babies at childbirth. That's when things took a huge turn for her. That's when she began to heighten tropes and norms that existed already. And to me, that just adds more vagueness as to whether this was real for her or not. And by the end of the film, and I do think you make an interesting argument, or at least bring up a great point in the sense that by the end of her life, it may be something that she just completely owned by the end of it. Even if it started out as this excuse to remove herself from cultural norms as a facade. But then by the end of it, because it had begun to define her now, it is her religion. She has completely bought into the female Christ persona, if you will, that by the end of her life, it was hers now. This religion, this thing that I've created, it is mine. I'm fully buying into it, even if it did not start out that way. And I do think there is an interesting evolution of Ann in this film in that regard. But I'm with you. I do think at least in the initial setup of it, in the immediate aftermath of the prison sequence, I do think there is a lot to this film that it was simply born from a pragmatic perspective, and it had nothing to do with faith.
Well, in a way, I think there is still the argument that maybe she did buy into it by the end because she founded this and had this really traumatic experience with her 4 kids at a very young age, right? So it gets to this point where all she really knows is this facade of a creation that she made. By that point, you have no choice but to go along with it because
and she had a huge reputation. She had a huge reputation by
and
that
now
point
it's all
as well.
you know. Sometimes you might just psychologically start to convince yourself that this is what you believe, and then you start to believe that belief, right?
Yeah.
So there's a psychological element to it that could potentially be there that does add a fascinating layer to it, which is what makes Amanda Seyfried's performance overall quite strong. It is a very physical performance, and there were moments, at least in the first half, where I thought, is this going to be purely a physical performance and not as introspective as I would like? But I do think she's able to find a lot of those inner things that we look for in more internalized performances that do come through.
I agree.
And that's sometimes even more difficult to pull off. We tend to respond more to internalized performances on this podcast, and there is a lot about Amanda Seyfried here that is very internalized while also being very external at the same time. And I think she's very good at that.
Well, and I think that's why those early scenes and why this film goes full Hamnet at a point in terms of showing us that trauma.
It's graphic. It is wildly graphic.
It is. It's very Hamnet in that regard. It does not hold back. It goes full bore into it. And those scenes, I mean, you know me, I've been quite vocal about how I responded to Hamnet here on this show, and similarly had a visceral reaction to those scenes. And I just cannot help myself. As a father, I'm very emotional. I wear my emotions on my sleeve most of the time, especially when it comes to children and their suffering. And you know, I tease this in my opening thoughts, but 2025, slow down, stop.
2025 was really trying to break you. It was really trying to break you.
Trying to kill me. Goodness gracious. I look, when it got to September and I was like, I don't know about 2025. It's been kind of a so-so kind of year. Look, and again, we'll get to it here in a few weeks. I think overall 2025 is going to end up being a really great year. In fact, I was thinking about this earlier today because last year at this time, and I still believe this way, I think 2024 will go down as one of the best years of the century so far. Like, I'm that high on it. Not the decade, of the century so far. But I went back and looked at my list. There are a lot of indie films, small films, overlooked films, foreign films on that list that I can see why 2024 will just be completely overlooked by a lot of people, because a lot of the big films of that year were polarizing or not as well received. So 2024 is going to be an interesting conversation, even though I truly think it is elite. But 2025 is such a fascinating middle ground by the end of the year that I have really come around on it. But so much of it began in October. From October
it's more
to now.
Yeah, it's more top heavy in that regard as far as
as far as the trajectory of the year. And I think it was just one hit after another. And in that same time frame, was it not just a bunch of incredible, great movies that will be reminiscent of at least my year-end list? I don't know about you and Dave, but so many films about trauma and so many films about kids in the middle of that as well. And it's goodness gracious.
There was a thematic through line to 2025 that some other years just didn't quite have, which adds maybe a weird consistency to the year overall. We could talk about this when we get to our award show, but I'll simply say this. I'm looking at my published top 10 for 2024 that I did last year. Not much of it would change, surprisingly. Maybe a few things in the top 10, the order might shift a little bit. But I'll say this now, just given where we're ending up, I think I like 2025 more than 2024.
And I've seen that a lot. And I think that is very fair. And that's why I wanted to go back and look at my list from last year. And as I was looking at it, it was a lot of little small movies or indie films, a lot of overlooked movies that, unless you're talking to a devout cinephile or other film critic, 2024 is just going to be simply overlooked by a lot of people, which I think is like, to me, that's disheartening because I truly think it's a phenomenal year.
I will say this about 2024, and not to get too sidetracked here, but my top 2 from 2024 at the time, I'd say are still my top 2 as of now. That wouldn't change. And that's All We Imagine Is Light was my number 2, and my number 1 was Furiosa, a Mad Max saga. If hypothetically those 2 movies came out this year in 2025, they would probably still be my number 1 and number 2. So So in a weird way, I think I like 2025 better as maybe an overall year and the bountifulness of it. But maybe there's still yet another top heaviness to 2024 as far as where it hit hard. It hit hard in ways that this year hasn't quite yet for me, if that makes sense.
Sure.
So, I mean, we could talk about that more when we get to our award show. Consider this a appetizer for everyone listening. This is why you have to listen to our award show. I didn't we have these types of conversations.
I didn't even really mean to get that much into a detour here. I mostly brought all of that up to say 2025 for me hit at the tail end of the year. I do think up until September, it was kind of a mediocre year. It was obviously some great movies in there. Yeah, I mean, 28 Years Later in the summer, Sinners earlier in the year, obviously some great movies before September. But on the whole, I felt pretty so-so about the year comparatively to a lot of other years that we've experienced in recent time. But once we got to October, it was a huge snowball that just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And in the middle of all of that were all of these movies about trauma and grief and parenthood and children. And like, that's a theme that just kind of kept coming up and coming up. I don't know if we'll get to it next week. Kristen Stewart's new film, The Chronology of Water. I would like to find space for it if we can, because that's another film to add to this list. And it is quite the directorial debut.
Interesting.
Won't be for everybody, but
interesting.
It's an interesting addition to this overarching theme that we've been talking about. And I think The Testament of Ann Lee, to get back to that, I think does a great job of, again, showing us that grief quite vividly, quite viscerally. And Amanda Seyfried is very, very good at tapping that into her performance, that as the film unfolds and we start to question the validity of what her reasonings for it might be. Again, I think in Seyfried's performance, she does a great job of giving us a little bit of a vagueness, but when the time comes, when the musicality of the film is there, she's fully committed, fully devoted. It's primal, it's feral, as we've been talking about, and that is very necessary. So, like the physicality of the performance and how she really goes for it is obviously very important to this film and giving credence to, is this real or not for Anne? And it's really great. But I do think, to your point, the film does a great job of giving us these quiet little moments with Anne where Seyfried is able to tap into that internal dialogue. And it really is great. And maybe that's also why the voiceover here is unnecessary. I got to say, though, I got to admit, I can't hate it. I can't, because
Thomas McKenzie.
Thomas McKenzie. I'm sorry. I love her, and I just can't. I'm sorry.
It's a sin to give an actress like Thomas McKenzie too little to do in a movie. And given the fact that her character of Mary doesn't really have much to do outside of that voiceover, it almost feels like a way of the film remedying that. And I do think that's unfortunate, because I would have loved to see more from her as far as how Ann Lee's followers are affected by her devotion to this creation and faith. We mostly get that angle from Lewis Pullman, who plays William Lee, Anne's brother. He kind of represents the side of the innocent, if you will, who fall into this quote unquote trap, if you want to call it that, and how their lives are forever changed because of it. And these are people that do fully buy into what Ann Lee has created, maybe for reasons that are justifiable for them. And you feel bad for some of these individuals. And in many ways, William Lee kind of represents that population. And I do think Lewis Pullman is quite terrific at representing that side of it too.
Yeah, and to circle back to Mackenzie quickly, I do agree with you that she is ultimately wasted here, and not just in terms of the voiceover, but performatively, because she does play the character of Mary.
Yeah.
She is not given all that much to do. This film very much Alina Himes her, if you will. And for those that missed our mastermind conversation, we talked about Alana Haim. She was in 2 movies this year and was underutilized.
2
essentially glorified cameos in both.
Yeah,
films,
2 big,
movies.
big movie. The Mastermind wasn't really a big movie, but One Battle After Another certainly is.
Yeah, Mastermind though, Kelly Reichardt, we do love
it's a big
her.
movie for us.
Yes, big movie for us. And look, she's good in both of them, but they are glorified cameos essentially. And we just love Alana Haim that it was disappointing to essentially see that she had glorified cameos in both of those films. And it's a little bit of the same thing here with Thomasin McKenzie. She's not really in the film all that much, but that's also why I do gravitate toward the voiceover, because at the very least, her voice is prominent and it is there throughout the entirety of the film. So that's where Mary is mostly utilized. It's off screen in voiceover. And the voiceover, I don't think provides all that much. But again, that's where I go back to the screenplay, mostly failing this movie. But Thomasin McKenzie as a performer, God love her. I love the voice.
Great.
Yeah,
she's great. Yeah, and this has a great supporting cast. Some maybe more effective than others, given what they're asked to do. I think Christopher Abbott's pretty effective as Anne's husband. Tim Blake Nelson has maybe 1 or 2 scenes in the movie. His voice is almost unrecognizable. I don't know what he's doing here, but it's kind of incredible. It's I saw him. That's clearly Tim Blake Nelson, but he has a very distinct voice as well. He's just one of those individuals that just has a very distinct tonality to the way he speaks. And he is doing something so different here, but it's not noticeably different. It's a normal speaking voice that sounds nothing like Tim Blake Nelson. I was kind of shocked by that.
Yeah.
But he's quite good here as Pastor Reuben.
I agree. I like Tim Blake Nelson as well. To your point about Lewis Pullman, he had a great 2025. I think he's very good here as well in a poignant performance. And it's interesting when I think about William or another character, John Hocknell, and credit to David Kell in that performance. These are 2 characters that are devout followers of Anne. And my heart somewhat goes out to them because, again, I go back to that polarity with Anne. And they essentially become, I don't want to say victims, but their life is fully tethered to Anne becoming this Christ-like figure.
They're most affected by the ramifications of Anne Lee and what she taught. Or they're the most affected by that.
Exactly. And I think maybe there's a sense of lostness, perhaps, or I hesitate to use the word tragedy, but it's a little poignant to me that their lives were affected by something that may or may not be real.
Yeah.
That could have been a complete facade from Anne's perspective, but it did draw in devout followers, including her own brother. And there is a sense of lostness to that. But at the same time, these are men that are men of God. They're devoted to their faith. And ultimately, they do have a choice in this. It's not as if they were in a cult where if they leave, they're given the pill, they're given the drink, and they're dead. No, it's not like that at all. So they're not entirely blameless here. But it is, again, just interesting how the followers of Anne, they're just fully tethered to something that, from her perspective, at least with how the film presents it here. I'm not talking about real life, but something that just may or may not have been real. Like I find that provocative.
The way it kind of strips them of their agency involuntarily, in a way, is kind of what it does. I am glad you bring up David Cale, who plays John Hocknell, because I do think he's also very good here. Sadly, he may have my least favorite musical number in the movie, and I think that's not to do with his rendition or performance of it. There's one scene maybe midway through, I think the song is called like I'm Searching, I'm Led, where his finger is kind of guiding people to this field. it is maybe the one musical number that feels like, okay, that's a traditional musical number in a movie that was mostly filled with musical numbers that felt more organic and in the moment. That one just didn't. And I think that's maybe more to do with just the musical number itself and how it's intertwined within this narrative. And he sells the hell out of that. I think he's very good in that sequence in a vacuum. It's the one time where I felt like I was pulled into a completely different movie for a brief moment. And I say that begrudgingly because I think when the movie is operating as a musical, for the most part, outside of maybe just that one sequence, it is doing something that I don't think I've ever seen a movie musical do. And that's why I have to give this movie so many props, even if I do have a lot of reservations about the storytelling choices. Like I can't full on love this movie for those reasons, but I love so many things about it that it's doing aesthetically that it just makes me high on the movie regardless. I'm just not as high on it as I would like to be.
I will say this to be fair to Fastvold and Corbet. If there is one character here that would break normality and randomly indulge in song and dance, it would be the John Hocknell character. I think because
that's fair.
He is so devoted. And there are a couple of scenes here where he gets his moment to talk to God. There's a moment where he's sitting at a campfire and it's this extreme close up on him.
He's the most animated character in the movie in a way.
He is the most devoted.
Yeah.
And again, especially when we're talking about characters, people that are not related to Anne, but he fully believes Anne, fully buys into her persona as this female Christ figure. And what I love about some of the moments we get with him in the third act of this film, especially, come after his son has gone.
Sure.
And
yeah, that's a good point.
You would think that something like that could break you when you see that your son isn't as devoted as you or wants to live a different life than you, but it doesn't faze him really all that much. There's maybe a little heartbreak there on his face as his son goes, but once he leaves, he's with Anne all the way till the end. And he gets moments in the final act of this film where he's doing the prayer, he's lashing out at this guide who's taking them to this land that they'll be able to settle on. And he's yelling at this guy because he just wants to have his prayer. And then in his prayer, he's like, forgive me. I let my anger get the best of me, sort of a thing. And so like, I just feel like if there's one character here that would break into song and dance,
that's fair.
In an unconventional way.
That is a very fair argument. Very fair argument. I will give that to you.
But generally though, I do think, again, going back to the biopickiness of the like structurally, I don't know if the film is doing enough to make sense of its biopic formula at times. And I do think there's a lot of redundancy to it. I mean, honestly, so much of Anne as a character, I think, comes down to the trauma that we see with her at the beginning of the film, which is conveyed viscerally, as we already talked about, and Seyfried's performance and how that evolves over the course of the film, especially given the musicality of the film. But in terms of writing, there isn't really all that much more to the character beyond that. And from scene to scene, it is awfully redundant.
There is a moment maybe midway through where it almost seems as though Anne Lee's arc kind of comes at a standstill for the what is happening around them, which is very much a biopic-y thing to do. Yeah. It's really Amanda Seyfried as a performer that's able to fill in those gaps and almost act as a co-writer to make more sense of those things where it needs to be.
And I think she does do a great job of elevating beyond that writing, because it does get a point, especially once she decides we got to leave Britain and we're going over to the new Americas. Yeah. But even before then, a lot of what we see with the character is, again, there's the musicality of it. People are questioning the faith. There's the persecution of the faith. And that's it. Like, and that trifecta just repeats itself from moment to moment. The persecution changes, of course.
Sure.
Whether it be people in Britain that don't believe her, that judge her, people on the boat. What are you doing? Get out of our way. They perform a number, things change there. You get to the Americas. It's a lot of the same drama. Like there's not much that evolves in that regard.
I will say, I did like the movie when it briefly became Master and Commander for a little bit.
Yeah. Well, and again, that's where I go back to the filmmaking and the performances. Yeah. Like from scene to scene, I think there's a lot to this film that is invigorating despite the redundancies. And again, that's the only thing that keeps me from embracing this as one of my favorite films of the year. But I think inside of that structure, once we arrive at the moment, I think I'm able to let all of that slide away because, again, the music is phenomenal. Seyfried is really great. There's a lot to love inside each moment, despite the redundancies. Even everything we see at the end with the persecution that we see there. Again, it turns into almost a legit horror film at a certain point. Despite the redundancy of the drama, I was fully invested in it, like in that moment. And with the characters, and again, all of these dualities that we've been talking about. So like that's where I have to give Mona Fastvold just a lot of credit, despite the writing. I think she's able to overcome, for the most part anyway, those screenplay pitfalls, because each moment I just think is so riveting.
And I do think this does come down to the script. There are times we've seen similar issues like this before with true stories, and we sometimes have a hard time deciphering whether it's a script issue or an editing issue. But I don't think the editing is the problem here, primarily because of how well edited so many of these sequences are, just as hypnotic musical numbers, right? I think the way that some of these threads are intertwined isn't the problem. It's how some of these things do feel like it comes to a standstill as far as the dramatic momentum. And I think that is primarily a page issue. So I do agree with you there.
I mean, outside of those musical moments, and look, there's a lot of it. I mean, this film is a full-blown musical.
It's over half the movie. Yeah, it's primarily the movie.
Yeah. When it is acting as a biopic, I mean, there's nothing that happens here that isn't on her Wikipedia page.
Right.
I mean, it's just one of those movies. It is very biopic-y in that regard.
Yeah.
It is very Wikipedia in terms of plot, in terms of getting us from A to B to C. But again, that while I don't love that necessarily, I'm more than willing to overlook it because the execution here, the moment itself, is stunning.
You know what
it'll put you in a trance. It's really phenomenal to watch.
You know what this weirdly reminds me of, just given what you described the movie as there? This is a movie that is nothing at all like The Testament of Anne Lee. It has a very different tonal energy. But I think the same exact issues you could say about a movie like Rocket Man, the Elton John biopic / musical, where when that movie is not acting as an Elton John musical, it's pretty much a traditional music biopic, right?
Yeah.
But when it goes into its musical numbers, it comes alive, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of the same thing here. I mean, I think this is a more aesthetically interesting movie. So it certainly has that going for it. But I think it's kind of similar to something like Rocket Man as far as where that movie thrives and also where it kind of stumbles simultaneously.
Yeah. Sometimes it's just about the execution. That was the a lot of the criticisms I had with Monkey Man. Was that the name of that biopic?
Better Man, the Robbie Williams biopic.
Monkey Man.
Yeah.
I'm conflating monkey movies because there was a couple that year.
Hey, there was another one this year, and it was one of the worst movies ever made, remember?
Yeah, Better Man. Sorry, I'm conflating my monkey movies. But I have a lot of the same criticisms with that film. Better Man, fair. I feel like, is straight Wikipedia from a screenplay perspective.
Fair.
You learn nothing new from that film if you're just reading the script. But the execution of that film, the digital technology, the motion capture of it all, it is unlike any biopic we've ever seen in terms of what we're seeing on camera and the central performance of it all, which is obviously really great. So there's a lot to like about that film, even though it's quite conventional from a screenwriter perspective. And this is, and Rocketman is another good example as well. I mean, this is another one of those where it's, and thankfully there's not as much plotting here. There's not as much of that Wikipedia
it's not as told. It's more vibey than anything else. But
it
there
is
are
very
moments,
vibey.
yeah.
Yeah. Which is why ultimately those criticisms are way more softened for me here comparatively to some of those others. But in that similar vein, the execution, the scenes from moment to moment, the primal screaming, the musicality. Again, we haven't invoked Daniel Blumberg's name enough here. The score is just stupid. It is so good. It's really, really good. The music,
the
here is
songs
phenomenal.
too, because to your point, I'm glad you mentioned that he actually did a lot of homework in pulling from traditional Shaker hymns to reincorporate them here, so there is actual authenticity and historical accuracy of a sort when communicating these things. So I love that it feels very much of the time. It doesn't feel like it's overly modernized or anything like that. It does feel like I'm transported back into the 1700s when this type of primal musical worship could have been a thing. So his work makes me buy into the whole presentation of this.
Yeah.
And he's a huge component as to why it works.
And it's key here, as we noted in our opening thoughts. It's not just an invigorating cinematic exercise.
Yeah.
And the music is certainly central to all of that. I mean, just as a musical experience, boy, there's a lot to love here as a musical experience, but it is important to Anne's arc, as we noted earlier. And I just think he absolutely nails it, sticks the landing in an incredible way. And that to me is also what makes Anne Lee stand out amongst movies about grief, especially this year, because it's distinct from something like Hamnet, where we see the character, I guess really both the mother and the father in that film, gravitate toward art as this coping mechanism, and they both approach that very differently, obviously. Where here, it's obviously not about that, and it's not even about faith necessarily, where we've seen people grieving cling on to faith as some sort of guidance. I love that here faith is secondary. It's mostly like Anne searching for some sort of an excuse, and it could have been anything, but since she was already in this religious group, that's what she clings on to. And so she creates this facade that, again, may or may not be real, but the music has to give credence to all that. And without it, I mean, I do think this film falls apart, especially because of those screenplay criticisms, but my goodness, Blumberg it's just so good.
He's good at his job.
So good. Yeah. So I just love also how distinctive this film is in terms of how it approaches grief. And faith.
It's a unique experience for sure.
It's really nothing we've seen before. So I do think there's a lot to love with this film. And again, those screenplay issues aren't really all that cumbersome to me in the end. It's a little deflating for me. It sounds like it might have been a little bit more for you than for me. I think like this film a lot, though.
Yeah. I think we come at this movie at the exact same, I guess, angle, if that makes sense. But those similar angles that are affecting us, they're affecting me more than they are you, which has happened. Like many times, if we find ourselves at a bit of a distance with a certain movie, it's mostly because we still have the same brain in some ways, right? It's just certain elements that are affecting us. One might be more affected by those things than the other, and that tends to happen. Those things affected me more, and that's just a matter of taste, I guess.
Yeah, very much so. Because again, since we brought up Better Man, it was the reverse.
It was, yeah. I was more wrapped up
in
in that movie than you were.
Yeah, but my criticisms for that are the exact same criticisms you have for this movie, like verbatim, the exact same.
Yeah, and I think that's just it. Like that, the style of that movie, and I guess just the musicality and the overall world it was depicting was maybe something I was more invested in, and that's not as much an objective reading of the movie as it is a personal relationship to that material. And sometimes that happens. And it's just a matter of what that taste could be.
and take those exact same words that you literally just said right there and apply them to this film, and that's how I feel.
Exactly.
Yeah, I
this is
mean,
why this right here is why the film critic job is so important, right? Because all film critics don't go into movies the exact same way, contrary to popular belief, right?
yeah,
Like we have tastes. It's all about
yeah,
how we try to communicate those tastes to
yeah,
let listeners maybe get a different understanding and perspective as to what those
yeah,
things are. We thrive on this type of difference. Like this is what
mhm,
this is what it needs.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And sometimes it comes down to the small little things.
Yeah.
And I think for me, if we're comparing this film to how I responded to Better Man, is that there's just less writing here overall. Because, as
Sure.
you noted, the music element of it conveys over half of this movie.
This is more
So
operatic than
much
Better
more.
Man was. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so because there's less writing, there's less for me to have to grapple with in that regard. Where Better Man, there was so much more of it that I did have to grapple with it more. And that is ultimately the difference between how I felt about the two movies. And in the end, little less to grapple with. I am blown away by the music here. I love the performances here. I love the direction of this film, the production design, the costuming. All of that is fantastic. It's an immersive experience, and it's really great. I love the cinematography here from William Rexer. The editing, I think, is quite invigorating at times as well. So like there's so much for me to love here from a craft perspective. And that's more than enough for me in this case.
Yeah.
That I did really
It's
like
a very well made movie.
Yeah. The screenplay will just be the only thing that keeps this from, let's say, my top 20 of the year. Could it land in that 20 to 30 range? Probably. It's very much in that case. It's at the very least in my top 40 for sure.
Yeah. Maybe top 50 for me.
Yeah.
There's
So
a
that's
lot
kind
that
of
I
where
like
I'm at.
this year. Like there is a lot that I like this year. This is one of those movies where I'm probably going to land around like a 3.5 out of 5 on Letterboxd, which, I mean, mathematically speaking, what's that? A 3.5 out of 5, right? So that's about a 7 out of 10. That's a very high grade. And sometimes I feel like that gets misconstrued. If you see a big popular movie that's getting a lot of love and someone gives it like a 3 out of 5 instead of, let's say, a 4 or a 4.5, that means they didn't care for it. But that's actually a very high grade, right? And I feel that way about this movie, and it's because those things that are so good could have taken it to such a level that could have made it one of the best movies of the year.
Yeah. Yeah. Currently, and again, take this with a huge grain of salt because I have not really wrestled with my top 20 yet because we're getting closer and closer.
You have to start. You have to start, dude.
I've begun. No, look, I've begun the process. Look, I have a top 69 as it currently is right now. Now,
oh man, you missed a great opportunity.
Down.
You missed a great opportunity to not say I have a top 6-7.
Top 6-7, except that it is a 69 as it stands currently. Now I'm going to dwindle that down.
Sure.
When I release my list on Letterboxd, I'm not going to have 70 movies on there.
Of course not.
But those are the movies I'm wrestling with at this point. I have Ann Lee at 25. So I am high on it. It's not going to end up in the 20 unless I get a chance to rewatch it, which I probably won't by the time we get to the award show. But I am curious to revisit this film because I think there's a good chance that those narrative criticisms will be even less effective on me.
Well, now that you know to expect them.
Yeah, exactly. I know what to expect them. I can just relish the film as a cinematic exercise. And again, there's just so much to love there that I think ultimately I can very much come around on it. But look, the last 3 months have been incredibly rewarding. I was a bit worried. I was nervous that we were going to go into the 2025 award show and I was just going to be like, man, just not a year for me. Like I was nervous.
It's a strong year. It's a very strong year.
Oh yeah,
it took a long time to get there, but we did get there.
Yeah, it took a long time to get there. But yeah, I mean, again, I guess to round out this conversation since we brought it up earlier, but yeah, I was looking at my top let's say 40 here, I do think I'm going to end up coming around that this is an overall better year than even last year. But 2024 just might be a year for me. It just might be a subjective thing for me. Just because it's like when I was looking at that list, so many of those movies, like it's hard to recommend, and there's just not a lot of like mainstream movies, I guess you could say. And the one mainstream movie I do have in there is Furiosa, and who are you going to recommend that to? Like most people hated it, which is so sad to me.
It makes me feel better that it's almost my movie in a way, right? Calling that one, that's going to be one of my favorite movies of the entire decade when it's all said and done, I think.
Yeah, I'm really high on that film as well. But I mean, most of what I loved last year was Nickel Boys. That's a cinephile
Great movie. Great movie.
All We Imagine Is Light, Red Rooms. I Saw the TV Glow. Nobody knows about that movie outside of our circles, of course. But I'm not talking about our circles. Do not expect too much from The End of the World. Outside of our circles, nobody knows that movie.
Exactly.
Evil Does Not Exist. Another foreign language film. A Different Man, a small overlooked movie. Janet Planet, a small overlooked movie. Sing Sing, a bit of the same. The Beast, even in our circles, The Beast was a little bit overlooked.
Even the movies that may have garnered some more commerciality, if that's even a word, movies like The Substance, for instance, still not for everybody, right?
Yeah.
So
exactly. So like it was just one of those years where I feel like the best films were either overseas or they were these small overlooked movies that nobody really saw. Sometimes I think about Dying, another great example that even in our circles a bit overlooked. So like the only film I can think of that matches commercial success and overall praise was The Wild Robot.
Yeah.
So like,
yeah,
I guess Dune. Dune had that as well, like Dune and The Wild Robot. But those are like the only two.
I guess.
Well, there's no I guess. Objectively speaking, that film made a ton of money and was really well received.
I'm saying as far as others that like those are really the only ones. That's what I'm saying. I guess about.
Oh yeah. Gotcha. Yeah. It was really just those two. So it's just a year where I feel like its strength. And again, I think it's an elite year. I guess you could argue The Brutalist. I mean, that went on to win or at least be nominated for a ton of Oscars. But I don't like, would The Layman on the Street know The Brutalist from last year? Probably not.
I don't hear anyone talking about that anymore, even in our circle.
Oh, I mean, I see some things about it, but the thing about even in our circles, we are so in this time that I feel like most things are just thrown aside the second that we see them.
Oh yeah, it's to make room for what's now as opposed to what's then.
Yeah, because I think of, because, and I guess we can end here. I know we're going kind of long and we're way off Testament of Anne at this point.
I know,
but
making our own testament right now.
I think of something like Avatar: The Way of Water. So that film comes out, people go crazy. It makes $2 billion, and at the time, our circles, my social feeds, that's all we saw. People losing their minds. James Cameron is back. First time since 2009. It's a great movie. We're all losing our minds.
Yeah.
And now, even when a new Avatar is out, it gives incentive for people to bring back some of those thoughts about Way of Water. And all I see is fire and ash. That's all people are talking about. So like and even though that is a film that people loved at that time, but we live in the now. Like nobody, unless it's Christmas or a holiday, nobody really goes back anymore.
I like to, I don't think this is true. And this is just my way of convincing myself that this is the case. I like to think that Fire and Ash is doing so well financially. It seems to have more momentum than The Way of Water did at this time. I like to think that's because those people who are going to see Fire and Ash actually love The Way of Water so much. And that's the reason why.
The two are linked 100%. Yeah. There's the reason Fire and Ash is doing so well is because The Way of Water invoked the fan base and then brought in a whole slew of others.
Yeah.
So of course it's going to do better.
It brought back the Avatar heads and then converted new Avatar heads.
Exactly. So yeah, the success of Fire and Ash makes sense. But again, you don't see people talking about Way of Water. I don't see people talking about Oppenheimer all that much, but people consider it the best film of the decade so far. Like, people love Chalamet, but they're talking about Marty Supreme. I don't see anyone talking about Dune right now or anything else that he's done. Like the discourse, it's all about what's out right now.
Yeah.
So it's hard to judge.
It's always short term.
Legacy these days.
Movies are short term. They're guided to a particular year, and that's it.
Anyway, The Testament of Anne Lee. Go check it out. I really liked it a lot. Moral of the story there. Sorry for the rabbit hole there at the end. Anyway, for those that are still with us, thank you for listening all the way to the end here. If you agree or disagree, you can leave a comment below if you're watching on YouTube, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Hit us up on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky. You can always email us in sessionfilm@gmail.com. Okay, this week, it is going to be busy as usual. We had this review here. We are also talking about Park Chan-wook's latest film, No Other Choice. And I promise I'm going to release it this week. Rental Family. It is recorded. It's in the books. I'm going to get it out this week, I promise. So we will have those reviews as well. New Chasing the Gold, new Women in Session as well. And Chasing the Gold, make sure you stay tuned for Chasing the Gold, because we're getting to that point where Shadon is going to be doing predictions for Critics' Choice. That award show is coming up very, very soon, next week, I believe. Predictions for Golden Globes. Then we're going to be talking about the actual awards themselves. And then January 22nd, I think it is, Oscar nominations. So a lot happening in the next few weeks there as well. And Women in Session, I want to give them a shout out too, because they've just been knocking it out of the park. And
I've been just as busy. I love it.
Yes, they've been doing some really great stuff recently. And I want to shout out Andrew Corns as well. He was the latest critic spotlight they had on there. And he had a lot of great things to say about In Session Film. So I just want to say thanks to him and
absolutely
those kind words as well. So, all right, with all that said, thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for watching. We'll get out of here. We'll see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast. Anne Lee. Great movie. Provocative movie.
Very much.